I never expected the night to change my life, but when my friend's mom pulled me close and whispered, "Don't fight me tonight, just let it happen," I realized some moments can't be undone. The first thing that struck me as I walked up the familiar stone path was how little had changed. The same creaking porch boards, the faint smell of roses from the garden, even the wind chime that used to lull me to sleep during summer nights. It all felt as though time had politely stepped aside, waiting for me to notice its patience. I hadn't been here in years, and yet, the house carried the weight of memory as if it had been expecting me. When the door opened, it was her smile that greeted me before her words did. My friend's mom, though even calling her that felt too small now. She looked almost the same, but also entirely different. There was a poise in the way she stood, a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The years had only deepened her beauty, like time had polished her instead of wearing her down. "Look at you," she said, her voice warm but laced with something deeper, something unspoken. Her hand reached for my arm, and though it was a simple gesture of welcome, the touch lingered longer than courtesy required. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Crossing the threshold, I was wrapped in the same sense that once meant safety: freshly brewed tea, faint traces of cinnamon, the clean linen scent that always seemed to hover in the air. The house itself whispered memories back to me, but it was her presence that anchored me in the now. She guided me into the living room, her hand brushing against the small of my back as she led the way. The motion was natural, almost instinctive, yet it sent a current through me that I tried hard to disguise. She moved with a quiet confidence, as though aware of every detail around her, how the light fell across the wooden floor, how her movements filled the space. We exchanged polite words at first, catching up on the years gone by, my studies, my work, her life after so many changes. But beneath the surface of each sentence was a rhythm I couldn't ignore. Her gaze held mine just a heartbeat longer than expected, her smile tugged at something tender inside me. At one point, as she laughed at something I said, she reached out and briefly touched my hand resting on the armrest. The contact was feather-light, yet it carried weight. My skin burned where her fingers had been, though she withdrew as though nothing unusual had happened. I realized then that this visit wasn't going to be like the others from my youth. Something invisible stretched between us, subtle but undeniable. As the evening light streamed through the window, catching in her hair, I felt a quiet tension building, not awkward, not forced, but alive. Like two instruments slowly finding harmony in the same song. And though I tried to tell myself it was just nostalgia, just the comfort of a familiar home, I couldn't shake the sense that something new had begun the moment she opened that door. The kitchen was exactly as I remembered, though smaller somehow. Maybe it was me who had grown, or maybe time had made everything feel closer, more condensed. The overhead light cast a soft, golden glow across the counters, and the air carried the warm, homey scent of onions sizzling in butter. She moved easily in that space, the way someone does when every corner and drawer is second nature. Watching her cook felt almost hypnotic, each gesture unhurried, each movement graceful. "Would you chop those tomatoes for me?" she asked, sliding a wooden board toward me. Her voice was steady, but when our eyes met, there was something in her expression that felt searching. I nodded, rolling up my sleeves. The knife felt familiar in my hand, but it was the closeness of her presence that made me hyper-aware. She stood just inches away, reaching over occasionally to stir the pan. Every time her arm brushed mine, it was like a quiet spark, subtle but undeniable. We fell into conversation, the kind that doesn't demand attention yet pulls you in effortlessly. She asked about my work, not with the polite detachment of someone making small talk, but with genuine interest. Her eyes stayed fixed on me as I spoke, and I found myself saying more than I planned, about my doubts, my uncertainty, how the future sometimes felt like a road without clear signs. She listened in a way few people do, her head tilted slightly, her brow softening at my words. At one point, she rested her hand lightly on my forearm, just for a second, but it steadied me more than anything else. "And you?" I asked, realizing how much I wanted to know her beyond the title of my friend's mom. Her smile faltered briefly, not out of discomfort but honesty. "It's quieter than I expected these days. she admitted. The house feels bigger. Nights feel longer. You think you'll get used to solitude, but some parts of it never settle. There was no self-pity in her tone, only truth. I felt a heaviness in my chest, not because of her words alone, but because of the vulnerability she allowed me to see. We went on like that, small tasks, small words, yet everything felt significant. The brush of her sleeve as we reached for the same spice jar. The way her laughter filled the quiet kitchen, rich and warm, before trailing into silence that seemed to hold more than sound. By the time we sat down to eat, the air carried something unspoken between us. Our knees brushed under the table, lightly at first, then again, neither of us moving away. She smiled at me across the plates of food, her eyes glimmering with something I couldn't name but could feel in every corner of me. It wasn't just a meal. It was the start of a closeness I hadn't anticipated, woven through every word, every touch, every glance that lingered a little too long. Dinner stretched longer than either of us expected. Not because the food demanded it, but because either of us seemed in a hurry to let the moment pass. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, not with discomfort but with something unnamed that hung between us. She sat across the table, chin resting lightly on her hand as I spoke about the city, the people I'd met, the life I was still trying to piece together. Every time I glanced up, her eyes were waiting, steady, curious, almost studying me. I felt the weight of her gaze, gentle, not intrusive, yet it lingered in ways that unsettled me. At one point, her son's absence became more obvious. He'd left earlier to meet friends, promising he wouldn't be long, yet here we were, 2 hours later, sharing a dinner that felt more intimate than I dared admit. Her laugh came easily, spilling across the table like light, but then there would be pauses, long enough for silence to speak louder than words. In those spaces, I could feel my pulse pick up, my mind scrambling for reason. Why did her smile stir something in me? Why did the curve of her hand against the wine glass feel like a secret I shouldn't notice? When I reached for the salt, my fingers brushed hers. It was nothing, really, an accident. But neither of us pulled away immediately. Her hand was warm, steady, the faintest tremor beneath her touch. When she finally withdrew, her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a moment the room felt suspended. "You've grown into yourself," she said softly, almost as if to herself. "There's a calm in you now." Her words lodged in me. I wanted to answer, but what could I say? That her voice carried through me like a thread, pulling me closer? That the quiet way she looked at me made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years? Instead, I offered a smile, though my throat was tight. "I'm still figuring it out." The way she looked at me then, steady, unguarded, made my chest ache. It wasn't a look of passing interest. It was a look of recognition, of someone acknowledging something they weren't ready to put into words. We moved into the living room afterward, mugs of tea replacing the wine. The glow of the lamp softened the space, shadows dancing across the shelves. We sat closer than we needed to on the couch, shoulders nearly touching. Every so often, our eyes would catch. A few seconds too long, a breath too deep. It wasn't bold, not yet. It was restrained, like both of us were testing the edges of a possibility we hadn't named. And in those glances, in the silence between laughter, in the brush of a hand, in the rhythm of our breaths, I felt the undeniable truth: something had shifted. Neither of us had said it aloud, but the current was there, alive and humming, waiting for one of us to let it be seen. By the time the clock chimed 10, the house had grown quiet. My friend still hadn't returned, and the silence stretched out like a blanket over the rooms. I found her in the living room, the light low, a glass of wine cradled between her hands. She looked up as I entered, her expression softer than before, the lines of her face illuminated by the glow of the lamp. "Sit with me," she said, her voice gentle, carrying both invitation and something heavier. I lowered myself onto the couch beside her. The cushions dipped, drawing us closer, and for a moment the silence between us was filled only with the faint ticking of a clock. She swirled the wine absently, her gaze lost in the glass, before finally speaking. "You know," she began, almost hesitantly, This house used to be so full. Noise, laughter, footsteps running down the stairs. Now, it's just me most nights. There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. But her words carried a weight that pressed against me. I turned to look at her, really look at her, the way her shoulders curved inward as though bracing against something invisible, the faint tiredness in her eyes despite her smile. I guess I never thought about what it would be like once the kids were grown, she continued. You pour so much of yourself into everyone else, and then one day, you're left with the quiet. And the quiet, it asks questions you're not always ready to answer. Her honesty struck me. I wanted to reach for her, to offer some comfort, but hesitation kept my hands in my lap. I could only meet her words with my own. I don't think you're meant to answer all of them. Some nights, just having someone sit beside you, that's enough. She looked at me then, her eyes lingering, searching. The silence that followed was charged, not awkward but alive. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough that I wondered if she could hear it. Slowly she set her glass down on the table. Her fingers brushed mine as she pulled her hand back, and this time, the touch wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, though fleeting, like a test of whether the ground between us could hold. I don't usually talk about these things, she admitted, her voice lower now, almost fragile. But tonight, it feels different. You feel different. The words rooted me to the spot. I couldn't trust myself to speak, not without giving everything away. So instead, I stayed silent, letting the closeness do the talking. The lamp flickered slightly, casting shadows across her face. She leaned back, her head resting against the couch cushion, and let out a breath that seemed to carry months, maybe years, of held-in longing. In that stillness, something shifted. The air between us wasn't just quiet anymore. It was heavy with the weight of all we hadn't said, all we were afraid to admit. And though either of us moved closer, I knew in my chest that a line had been crossed. Not with words. Not with actions. But with truth. The silence between us deepened, no longer hollow but filled with something I couldn't name. My friend's mom sat beside me, her profile softened by the warm lamplight. The faint scent of her perfume, something floral, understated, seemed to drift between us, making the space feel even smaller. I shifted slightly, unsure if I should speak, but before I could find the words, she leaned toward me. Not much, just enough that her shoulder brushed mine. The touch was casual in appearance, yet the weight of it pressed straight into my chest. Her hand moved slowly, almost hesitantly, until her fingers grazed my wrist. She paused there, as if giving me a chance to pull away. I didn't. The warmth of her skin seeped into mine, steady and trembling all at once. I don't know why it feels easier to breathe when you're here, she whispered, not quite looking at me. Her voice carried no rehearsed tone, only honesty, fragile, unguarded. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her I felt the same, but words seemed clumsy in that moment. Instead, I let my hand turn over, letting her palm rest against mine. The fit was imperfect, but somehow right, her fingers lacing with mine in a quiet confession. When she finally lifted her eyes, I felt caught. Her gaze was steady, searching, but beneath it was a flicker of vulnerability, like she was balancing between strength and risk. She leaned closer, her cheek brushing against my chest as though she needed to hear my heartbeat to steady her own. The world outside seemed to vanish, the ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, even the possibility of her son returning at any moment. All that existed was her weight leaning lightly against me and the rise and fall of our breathing. I let my arms slip around her shoulders, unsure at first, then firmer as she nestled closer. Her body relaxed into mine, her head tilting until her temple rested against me. The warmth of her cheek burned through the fabric of my shirt, and I became acutely aware of every heartbeat, every breath. It wasn't passion that defined the moment, but something deeper. A hunger, yes, but more than that, a need for closeness, for recognition, for a comfort neither of us had admitted to wanting. Her hand traced lightly against my chest, stopping just over my heart. "You're steady," she murmured, her voice low. I needed steady tonight. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. My fingers brushed the side of her arm, memorizing the texture of her skin, the way her breath slowed as though she'd found shelter. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The embrace itself was enough, more than enough. It was a surrender, not of control, but of loneliness. For the first time that night, the quiet in the house didn't feel heavy. It felt alive, humming with the unspoken truth that we had stepped across a line we couldn't go back from. The room had grown still, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own breath. She hadn't moved from my side, her head resting lightly against me, her hand still pressed against my chest. I could feel the rhythm of her heartbeat through that touch, uneven, a little faster than before. Mine was no steadier. She drew back slightly, just enough to look at me. Her eyes were darker in the lamplight, shadows pooling in their corners, yet there was no hiding the vulnerability there. For a moment neither of us spoke. It was as though we were both standing at the edge of something, waiting to see who would step first. Her fingers slid upward, tracing the line of my collarbone before resting at the back of my neck. The touch sent a shiver through me, not from surprise but from the weight of what it meant. She was asking without words, giving me every chance to turn away. Instead, I leaned closer, my forehead brushing gently against hers. The contact was tender, delicate, but the closeness left no space for doubt. Her breath mingled with mine, warm and uneven, and I could smell the faint sweetness of wine on her lips. Her voice broke the silence, a whisper so soft I almost wondered if I imagined it. "Don't fight me tonight, just let it happen." The words sank into me with startling force. They weren't a command. They weren't even bold. They were a plea, an unguarded request to stop resisting what we both already felt. My chest tightened. 100 reasons rushed through my head, warnings and hesitations. She was my friend's mother. This was a line we weren't supposed to cross. But all of that drowned beneath the sincerity in her eyes, the way her hand trembled against my neck as though afraid I'd pull away. "I'm not fighting," I whispered back, my voice low but certain. The relief that softened her face in that moment was something I'll never forget. She closed her eyes, her forehead still resting against mine, and let out a breath that seemed to carry months, maybe years, of unspoken longing. I drew her closer, my arms wrapping around her with a firmness I hadn't dared before. She fit against me effortlessly, her body pressing into mine, her hand curling into my shirt as though anchoring herself. The warmth of her filled every space between us. We didn't need more than that. No kiss, no rush forward. Just the quiet intensity of holding each other, of admitting with our bodies what our words hadn't dared to touch. Time felt suspended, the clock ticking in the background almost mocking in its reminder that this night wouldn't last forever. But for that moment, for the breath we shared, for the way her voice still echoed in me, nothing outside that living room mattered. We had crossed into something fragile, dangerous, and beautiful all at once. And I knew there was no going back. The clock chimed midnight though either of us moved. Her weight was still against me, her hand still curled lightly in the fabric of my shirt. The world beyond that room, the night air, the quiet street, the chance of someone walking through the door, felt distant, unimportant. All that mattered was the stillness we had found, the way her presence filled the emptiness that both of us had been carrying. When she finally stirred, it wasn't to pull away but to shift closer. She rested her head against my shoulder, her cheek brushing the side of my neck. The warmth of her skin sent a wave of calm through me. My arm tightened around her instinctively, holding her as though I could shield her from every lonely night she had ever endured. "You have no idea," she whispered, her voice faint, "how much I needed this. Not just tonight, but in general. To feel close to someone again. To feel seen." Her words landed heavy in my chest. I thought of all the times I had seen her over the years, laughing in the kitchen, calling her son to the table, tidying a house that never seemed to rest. She had always been steady, always composed, and yet now, I saw her differently. Not as the figure of stability I once knew, but as a woman who longed for connection as much as anyone else. "I see you," I said softly. And I meant it, not just in that moment, but in every moment that had led us here. She lifted her head, her eyes shimmering with something both tender and uncertain. For a second, it seemed as though she might speak, but instead she only gave me a smile. It wasn't playful or forced. It was the kind of smile that carried gratitude, relief, and something fragile that words could never fully hold. We sat like that for what felt like hours. No rush, no urgency, just the quiet joy of being close. Our fingers intertwined, our shoulders pressed together, and every so often, she would glance at me as if checking to see if I was real, if this connection hadn't been imagined. Eventually, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock reminded us that the night had to end. But neither of us was ready to break the spell. She stood slowly, and I followed, our hands still linked until the very last second. At the doorway, she hesitated, turning to face me. Her hand brushed my cheek, tender and fleeting, before dropping back to her side. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 simple words, yet they carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. As I stepped into the night air, the cool breeze brushed against me, but inside I felt only warmth. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that lingers, quiet, steady, alive. The night hadn't ended in passion. It had ended in something rarer, a bond fragile but real. And I knew, as surely as I breathed, that what we shared would not fade with the sunrise.